Hello, History Geeks. It's me, Miss Carol. And today's edition is going to be focused on the growth of cities in American culture. We're still in period 6, and this is probably our third major topic. We've already talked about industrialization and the labor movements, and now we're going to talk about the growth of cities and American culture. So here goes. So here is a famous quote that you might have heard before, and maybe you haven't. So, give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest tossed, to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. This is a poem by Emma Lazarus called The New Colossus, and it was written in 1883. This poem really says a lot about American culture and cities during this time period because this is a time of great immigration, increased immigration. And this is also a time period when the cities, the major cities of this country, were really kind of, well, they were absolutely growing in leaps and bounds, but they weren't super safe places. They weren't super clean places. And people really lived in, poor people really lived in almost exquisite squalor. And we're going to talk more about that as we move on here. So we first need to discuss immigrants. In the last half of the 19th century, the U.S. population more than tripled from about 23.2 million in 1850 to 76.2 million in 1900. During this time, 16.2 million immigrants arrived into this country and obviously fueled the growth of the population. In addition to this 16.2 million, we see 8.8 million more immigrants arriving during the peak years of immigration, which is a 9-year span from 1901 to 1910. Now, why are these people leaving their countries, and why are they coming to the United States? And to talk about that, we need to talk about push, which are negative factors as to why people are leaving, and pulls, which are positive attractions of their adopted country, which in this case obviously is the United States. So here are some pushes. One, poverty of displaced farm workers driven from their land by political turmoil and the mechanization of farm work in their own countries. Two, overcrowding and joblessness in cities as a result of population boom. So they're kind of just looking to get out of Dodge because their situation isn't very good at home. Another push is religious persecution, and this comes into play mostly with Jewish people experiencing extreme anti Semitism in Eastern Europe. Pulls, reasons why people would want to come to America is one, our country's reputation for political and religious freedom. Two, economic opportunities afforded by settling in the West. And three, abundance of industrial jobs in US cities, which was actually true, but those jobs didn't pay a lot and you worked in pretty crappy conditions and the grass isn't always greener on the other side. But to some degree, for these people, even if they were living in squalor and 8 people living in a 1-bedroom apartment tenement slum, it was still marginally better than what they were experiencing at home. So to get here, most of these immigrants traveled by steerage, which is the bottom of the boat. It was economical. It wasn't hygienic. There wasn't really anything good about it, but it was a cheap way to get here. And a lot of people chose that as an option. And this was played out pretty grandly in the movie Titanic, which I don't know if any of you have seen, but Jack has a steerage ticket to come to the United States, or to be on the Titanic. So just to give you an example. So, who's coming here? When we want to start examining this, we need to start talking about old and new immigrants. So, old immigrants who came in the 1880s are coming from Northern and Western Europe, essentially the British Isles, Germany, and Scandinavia. They are typically Protestant. The Irish and Germans that came during this time were mostly Catholics. They had a high level of literacy, and which meant they could read well, and they had the ability to do occupational skills. They were skilled workers. The new immigrants were much different. They were from Southern and Eastern Europe, typically Italians, Greeks, Croats, Slovaks, Poles, and Russians. They were typically poor and illiterate, so they could not read. They were unaccustomed to democratic traditions because of the way that their countries' governments were set up. They were typically Roman Catholic, Greek Orthodox, Russian Orthodox, and Jewish, which raises a lot of flags when they get here to America. And when they got here, a lot of them ended up settling in ethnic or poor ethnic neighborhoods in New York and Chicago. Maybe you've heard of Little Italy, which is still a staple in New York City, way, way, way downtown. It's a place in Manhattan where Italians who got off the boat stayed because other Italians who got off the boat before them also stayed, and they had a real sense of community there. 25% of these people are what we call birds of passage, young men who were contracted for unskilled factory, mining, and construction jobs. And essentially, they would come here, make their money, and they'd go back home to help their families out. After they saved up a fair amount of money, they'd go back home and be with their families. So we Americans get anxious that we have so many people coming here, and pretty much we're letting everybody that wants to come here in. And then around 1886, we finally kind of put the brakes on immigration, and we lay down some legislation that stops certain people altogether from coming and or slows down other immigration, other people coming. So one, the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 essentially puts a ban on all new immigrants from China. This is outright sad and pretty terrible. I have a little short clip to share with you in class when we talk about this the next time I see you. They also decided they didn't want undesirable people to be able to come to the country. So paupers, people who had no money. They didn't want criminals, people with criminal records, convicts, people who, well, criminals obviously are people who commit crimes, and convicts are people that have been accused of crimes. And anyone who happened to be diagnosed as mentally incompetent. Another piece of legislation that they came up with during this time period was the contract labor law, which went into effect in 1885. And this, excuse me, essentially what that did was restrict temporary workers. So to go back to these birds of passage, this legislation would help to hire people that are going to stay here for the long term and not people that are just going to come, make some money, and then go back home. The idea was to protect American workers. It's kind of a nativist idea. 1892, we see the opening of Ellis Island. This is where new arrivals, so these new immigrants, would come to America, and they had to pass through Ellis Island. They'd have to pass medical examinations and pay a tax and make sure they had all this paperwork together and a sponsor and so on and so forth. And side note that Ellis Island is a really cool place to visit. If you ever get to New York City, I highly recommend you going. Efforts to restrict immigration were supported by diverse groups like labor unions, fearing that employers would use immigrants to depress wages and break strikes. Nativists, obviously. Nativists even came up with a group, the American Protective Association, which essentially openly criticized and was prejudiced against Roman Catholic. Whew, excuse me. And then social Darwinists, which we talked about when we talked about the great industrialists like J.P. Morgan and Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie. Social Darwinists viewed immigrants as biologically inferior to English and Germans, and therefore, essentially, survival of the fittest would just end up taking over. So, with this onslaught of increased immigration, and now we have all these people who come here and make more people, and so on and so forth, we're going to see some rapid urbanization. So, urbanization essentially and industrialization happen hand in hand. In the 1900s, 40% of Americans lived in towns or cities. So this left farms for industrial. They would be leaving their farms and coming into the cities for industrial and commercial jobs. The Great Migration is something that takes place during this time period between 1897 and 1930. This is when millions of Southern Black folks decide to move north or west and leave the South because of things like Jim Crow, Black codes, no industrialization, no opportunity for jobs, no political freedoms, so on and so forth. And I have a tremendous article that I'm going to share with you about the Great Migration that's just epic. It's from the Smithsonian Magazine. Changes in cities. So now we're seeing all this increased immigration. So we're seeing lots of changes and growth in our cities. We now have what's called streetcar cities. This allowed for people to live away from their jobs, and they could take mass transit for the time, transportation in. So they could take electric trolleys, elevated railroads, and subways. Urbanization also led to segregated urban cities by income. So you knew by walking around certain sections of the town who had money and essentially who didn't have money. We're also going to see skyscrapers. And skyscrapers in the 1880s are, small compared to what our massive skyscrapers look like today. But in 1885, a 10-story tall building is built in Chicago. Now we're also going to see the dawn of ethnic neighborhoods. So this is going to be essentially a contingency of slums and tenement apartments where you can cram more than 4,000 people into one city block, otherwise known as dumbbell tenements. But people who move to these places maintain their language, their culture, their church, and their social club. And even though they were living dirt poor, they were living together and they were okay with that. Also, they're going to have newspapers in their language and covering stories that are interesting to them, as well as schools that they feel comfortable sending their kids to. Now, as a result of urbanization in growing cities and slums and tenements and so forth, we're going to see a big uptick in reform movements during this time period. So because of these problems in urban society, which include poverty, health issues, etc., we're going to inspire new social consciousness among the middle class. So reform movements become a really big thing during this time period to help the urban poor. Settlement houses, which is going to be on your next vocab quiz, is essentially a pet side project that well-educated middle-class men and women would move into these immigrant neighborhoods and buy a building, essentially, and they learn about the problems that the families were having, and then they would try to set up interventions to help these folks. So they would provide all sorts of social services. One such famous place was the Hull House, and that was set up in Chicago by Jane Addams. And essentially, she helped to teach English, early childhood education, industrial arts, music school, and neighborhood theaters, and provide these interventions and opportunities for the immigrants who would not be able to get it outside of their community because they didn't have access to it. So by 1910, there's more than 400 settlement homes or settlement houses in America's largest cities. And this helps, of course, to lay the groundwork and foundation for the entire field of social work. Essentially, also through this movement, we're going to see political activists who crusade for child labor laws, housing reforms, and women's rights. We also are going to see the preaching of the social gospel, which is essentially importance of applying Christian principles to social problems.